Hello and welcome back to the conclusion of my Bob Dylan reviews, a project I should have finished almost 3 years ago, but that I didn't for various reasons. Today I'm going to be covering Blonde on Blonde, one of my favorite albums from Bob Dylan. Actually, scratch that, my favorite album from Bob Dylan. The conclusion of the trilogy, one of my favorite albums of the 60s, etc., etc. I'm not going to go too deep into the background because this is around the time where Bob Dylan starts to really hide everything about himself from the public, and it becomes a little bit hard to build a timeline. But the gist of it is that it was recorded in Nashville by a very different band, I think mostly a country band in Nashville, although you would not know that with the exception of one or two tracks on here. And a lot of the material was written on the spot. It's a more personal album than the last two. There's a little bit less of the Bob Dylan surrealist poet, speaker of a generation stuff on here, and there's a lot that points forward to the way he would completely drop that side of his image on the next album. But at the same time, it is the last album for a very long time where he was really aiming to be Bob Dylan saying anything of substance. And I don't mean that as like a put down on his later 60s stuff and his 70s material, but just sort of a statement of my opinion. Maybe their Bob Dylan fans are going to grill me in the comments, but I doubt that somehow. As a side note, sort of meditating on the Electric Trilogy, it's interesting a lot of the time when you have trilogies in music, the first two albums will be one thing. And then the third album will actually be something else entirely that doesn't fit in that much with the first two albums. Like a perfect example of this is the Berlin Trilogy by David Bowie. Low and Heroes, basically the same thing in a lot of ways. Lodger, something else entirely. And that's kind of true for this sequence, but also kind of not, because you could easily read Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61 as being one thing and Blonde on Blonde as being something else. But by the same token, you could easily read Bringing It All Back Home as being one thing and Highway 61 and Blonde on Blonde being something else. I choose to interpret that Blonde on Blonde as something else. There's probably an argument to be made that I have myself forced the albums into a narrative that they don't actually cohere to, but yeah, that's kind of just... all of criticism is just kind of bloviating at times, and this is one of those times. Yeah, this intro has not been a success. The thing about Bob Dylan is that he's done such a good job of obfuscating what he talks about that a lot of the time it feels like there's almost not a point in talking about Bob Dylan, that you're just sort of being like... And yeah, this, as I said, not a success. We're going into the track reviews. I am so sorry. So the album begins with an out-and-out joke track, which has entered the annals of history primarily for its chorus and its almost drunken, rambling musical elements. It's a really fun track, and I enjoy the way it sort of subverts the conventions of the previous two albums Dylan had done, where there would be these epic, powerful, symbolic opening tracks, whereas here we just have Bob Dylan saying that everybody has to get stoned. So track 2 is Pledging My Time, an excellent bluesy thing. The lyrics are good here, but to me at least this is not one of Dylan's best. I do enjoy it though. Visions of Johanna is excellent, a wonderfully evocative track, one of the best on the album, one of the most iconic on the album in many respects. Although I do think there's maybe a critique to be had that it's just a tiny bit too long, but it's one of the best examples on this album of the sort of Nashville by way of NYC vibe that a lot of this stuff has. A lot of these tracks, they're played by some of the finest country musicians active at the time, and yet it comes off as very cosmopolitan, very urban music, which is very strange since a lot of it is based in a very sort of rural vernacular. Sooner or Later is another brilliant track, possibly about a failed relationship, but like I said, I don't know. It could also be about a relationship with his fans. It's a really good track, one of my favorites on here. Also, the only one on the album recorded with the New York City band that he had originally put together in late '65 to record this album. And I have to say, it's impressive that despite the fact that this is, I think, more or less the same band that did Highway 61, it sounds more like Blonde on Blonde than that album. I Want You is another wonderful track, one of the most straightforward songs on the album, except for that bit at the end, which is apparently about Brian Jones. Allegedly, Ballad of a Thin Man is also about Brian Jones. Supposedly, Bob Dylan liked Brian Jones, but also he seems to have not been particularly fond of him. That seems to be a running thread in a lot of Bob Dylan's music from this period. This track is another absolutely phenomenal and very iconic track. Sort of a great rambling thing. Verbose, surrealist, absurdist. A lot of strange directions here. One of my favorite types of Bob Dylan song. Like a lot of these tracks, it has been interpreted as attacking the counterculture, but like I said, trying to find meaning in these tracks honestly feels like an exercise in futility to me a lot of the time, but yeah. In a lot of ways, this track is this album's version of Ballad of a Thin Man, a vicious and spiteful attack on an individual and materialism submerged in the bitter tale of a failed relationship and the jealousy of a spurned lover. Or it could just be a song about a leopard skin pillbox hat. So we end the first disc with Just Like a Woman. One of the most beautiful things Bob Dylan has ever recorded, although the lyrics are a little bit sexist at times. Allegedly, it's about Edie Sedgwick, one of the Warhol girls, although the last verse, I think, is almost certainly about Joan Baez. Because this is a double disc album, I thought it would be kind of fun to do an interlude in the middle where I bring up some stuff that I forgot to mention in the opening of the album. Beginning that with the fact that this is one of the first double disc albums in rock music. Through some miraculous process, Columbia actually lost the release date of this album at some point over the last 55 years. And this is important because in June, what was probably the second double disc record in the history of rock music came out, the Mothers of Invention's seminal debut album, Freak Out. There's some debate as to which of the two came out first, because generally people assume this came out in May. The charts would apparently suggest it came out in June. I don't think it really matters, but it's really fascinating that a company could lose the release date of a huge album like this one. The second thing is that every song on this album begins with harmonica, which a friend of mine who hates this album pointed out to me and includes in every critique of this album that he makes. I don't find that to be a critique, but it's something that I noticed for the first time after he mentioned that, and I had never noticed it before, so I'm spreading it along to you. So if you wind up hating this album because you notice that every song begins with the same harmonica, there is a man in Brazil who is personally responsible for that. And that's all I really had to say. Let's change the record, get the groove going, and start again. This is one of my favorite tracks on the album. It has this very martial, almost marching band rhythm to it, and yet it's very catchy. Lyrics, once again, seemingly about a failed relationship. And yeah, it's a really good song. Not a whole lot much more to say. This is one of the lesser tracks on the album for me. That harmonica intro goes on for a comedically long period of time. Although I always find myself humming the chorus, so I guess it does something right. It's not a total loss. I mean, what am I talking about? No Bob Dylan song from this period of his career other than Ballad in Plain D is a total loss, but you know what I'm saying. This track is catchy, oblique, surrealist, and just in general, 60s Dylan. Fourth Time Around is a beautiful, if repetitive, song that has been alleged also to be about Edie Sedgwick, which I gotta say, I don't know what happened between her and Bob Dylan, but if the 3 songs on this album that people say are about her, then Bob Dylan did not think very highly of her by the end of whatever it was they had. Although, that being said, there is a more popular interpretation of this track, which is that it is a sly diss at the Beatles' song Norwegian Wood, which it shares a broadly similar melodic structure and, in particular, sort of lyrical bent with. Norwegian Wood is one of several attempts by John Lennon to write songs that were explicitly Dylan-esque during this period. In 66, 67, when Lennon was going through a bit of a rough time mental health-wise, he was convinced that this track, and specifically this line at the end, which I could not include because of copyright, was a direct admonishment from Bob Dylan to Lennon not to rip him off. Which is one of those things where I don't know if that's what this song is about, but if it is, then if it is, it's one of the most oblique diss tracks I've ever heard of. So the second to last song on the album is obviously Five Believers, a track that brings to mind something that a musician who I follow and like very much said last year, which is that every truly great album has a song that you just skip. You know, it's a good song in isolation, but you skip it when you listen to the album. And for me, this is that song. It's the most sort of Dylan by numbers thing on the album. He's not saying much on here, and it comes before what to me is maybe Bob Dylan's best song. So, yeah. I like it, but the flow, it kind of doesn't fit in the flow anyway. So the album ends with the 12-minute Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, one of my favorite Bob Dylan songs, probably the best song on the album. A beautiful ballad directed primarily at his wife. Something that was always speculated and that Dylan effectively confirmed during their very bitter and public divorce a decade later, which to me is a massive signifier of how good a ballad is. If your positive impression of a ballad can survive the knowledge that the singer acrimoniously divorced this woman, that's a great ballad. Blonde on Blonde is, well, it's everything I said it was in the intro. It's my last favorite Bob Dylan album for a while. You know, I like late 60s Bob Dylan. I like early 70s Bob Dylan. I like pretty much everything he did up to that point after Desire, where he started doing that really nasally whine that he just did for like 13, 14, 15 years. You know, but to me, he never made an album that was as consistently good as this one again, at least until the 90s, and even then, outside of Time Out of Mind, I don't think he's ever quite reached these same heights again. This is just, quite simply, one of the best albums you're ever going to hear. It is very, very good, and I absolutely did not do it justice, but hopefully you will listen to some of the snippets of music I have inserted into this that you have not heard because the copyright bots did not like this video. Be inspired to check out this album yourself by my inarticulate ramblings. I finally got this video to you. I will probably never cover Bob Dylan again. That's a joke. I probably will at some point. But probably not for a long time until I figure out a way to actually cover Bob Dylan without just being like, this is a good song. This is a good song. Wikipedia says in 1965. Have a good night, everybody.